All right, let's jump right in. Today, we are unpacking a truly fascinating explainer on the philosophy of selective caring. Now, if you think back to the mid-2010s, you probably remember feeling totally exhausted by this relentless cultural pressure to just be relentlessly positive all the time, right? This constant heavy push to strive for more money, perfect relationships, and perpetual optimism created what we now call toxic positivity. Well, today, we're going to break down exactly why that mindset is a total trap and how escaping it can actually lead to a much more fulfilling life.
Okay, let's dive into this with a completely counterintuitive story. Meet Charles Bukowski. He was an alcoholic, a highly cynical post office worker, and for decades, a totally unsuccessful writer. But here's the thing. When he finally achieved fame late in life, he didn't suddenly become this pristine, perfect citizen. He stayed a mess. In fact, his tombstone literally reads, "Don't try." And that represents a profoundly powerful idea. Bukowski's success didn't come from pretending to be perfect or forcing some fake version of self-improvement. It came from radically accepting himself exactly as he was. Flaws and the whole shebang.
But, society doesn't usually teach us that kind of raw acceptance. Instead, we get trapped in what's known as the feedback loop from hell. Because we are constantly bombarded with highlight reels of people living these spectacular lives, we start to feel like any negative emotion is a failure. So you feel anxious. Then you notice that anxiety and think, why am I so weak? Now you're anxious about being anxious. Finally, it just spirals into total self-loathing. We literally trap ourselves in an endless cycle of self-condemnation just for feeling natural human emotions. To break that loop, we really have to master the subtle art of choosing what actually deserves our attention. Now, a huge misconception is that not caring means being completely apathetic. That is entirely wrong. It is not indifference, it's being comfortable with being different. It means caring so deeply about your own goals and your own values that you happily endure the temporary embarrassment, judgment, or adversity required to actually achieve them. Indifferent people, they're just hiding. Truly driven people look adversity right in the face and just keep moving. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it completely flips our normal view of happiness. We usually treat happiness as this pain-free destination, like, if I just get that promotion, I'll finally be happy. But biological dissatisfaction is actually a feature of our species, not a bug. Think about it. Physical pain tells us to pull our hand away from a hot stove. Psychological pain, like loneliness, tells us our social environment needs fixing. Suffering is literally designed to prompt action. Therefore, happiness isn't the absence of problems. Happiness is the active, ongoing process of solving them.
But since we have to solve problems, we first have to admit what they actually are. Imagine a superhero called Disappointment Panda. Now, instead of fighting crime, his superpower is knocking on your door and delivering incredibly uncomfortable truths. He'd look at you and say, "Sure, you make a lot of money, but your kids despise you because you're literally never home." Ouch, right? It sounds harsh, but Disappointment Panda is actually a savior. He forces people to confront their root problems instead of just masking them with denial, playing the victim, or drowning in toxic positivity.
Which brings us to a question I want you to ask yourself right now. What pain do you want to sustain? If happiness comes from solving problems, then you have to actively choose your struggles. Everyone says they want a brilliant career, but are you willing to actively choose the 60-hour work weeks and the tedious paperwork? Everyone wants a fit body, but are you willing to endure those sweaty, exhausting 6 a.m. gym sessions? The struggles you are genuinely willing to sustain are what ultimately determine your success. A major roadblock to choosing our struggles, though, is entitlement. It's this toxic belief that you are somehow special and normal rules just don't apply to you. And it takes two forms: superiority, which is I am amazing, or martyrdom, which is I am a victim. Let me tell you about a guy named Jimmy. Jimmy was a perpetually broke entrepreneur. He constantly pitched massive business ideas, but whenever they failed, it was always someone else's fault. Bad luck, bad partners, whatever. Jimmy's delusional confidence was really just a defense mechanism to protect himself from admitting the hard truth. He was actually just average. And you know what? Jimmy's fear of being average is incredibly common, and we can thank the tyranny of the bell curve for that. Most of us sit right there in that massive middle bar. We are perfectly average at almost everything we do. But the media only exposes us to the extreme edges, the top 0.1% of absolute geniuses or the bottom 0.1% of utter disasters. This makes us completely terrified of being in the middle. But realizing and accepting your averageness is actually incredibly liberating. It strips away all that anxiety and frees you up to just do the quiet, daily work of improving yourself.
Consider the story of Hiro Onoda. He was a Japanese intelligence officer who literally spent 30 years hiding in the Philippine jungle after World War II, fighting a guerrilla war because he flat out refused to believe the war was over. He suffered immensely, but he did it for a deeply held value, uncompromising loyalty. Now contrast his deeply held value with modern consumerism, which often just brings a hollow, empty kind of suffering. The lesson isn't that Onoda was right to stay in the jungle, but it shows us that the quality of our lives isn't determined by whether we suffer, but by the values that dictate why we suffer.
So, how do we actually figure out what our values are? Well, we have to peel back what we call the self-awareness onion. Step 1 is just the surface, identifying what you feel, like anger or sadness. Step 2 goes a bit deeper, asking why you feel it. But step 3, that is the hardest layer of all. You have to identify the core personal value or metric you are using to judge the entire situation. If you're furious that a coworker ignored you, is your underlying value a need to always be right, or is it a genuine desire for mutual respect? And this brilliantly illustrates the real difference between what makes a value good or bad. Good values, things like honesty, self-respect, or curiosity, are reality-based, socially constructive, and completely internal. They are 100% within your control. Bad values, like needing to be universally popular, desiring endless material wealth, or demanding to always be right, are completely dependent on external forces. When you choose bad values, you literally leave your happiness entirely at the mercy of other people and unpredictable circumstances. To see how heavily these metrics dictate our lives, just look at Dave Mustaine. He was kicked out of Metallica right before they blew up. So he formed Megadeth, sold 25 million albums, and became a total rock legend. Yet he admitted he still felt like a failure. Why? Because his metric was external. Metallica sold 100 million. Now, contrast him with Pete Best, who's kicked out of the Beatles right before their global stardom. He was devastated at first, but eventually changed his metrics. He measured his life by his stable, loving family, and ultimately felt his life was a massive success. The circumstances were so similar, but the metrics made all the difference. Changing your metrics absolutely requires taking control, which brings us to the William James experiment. Back in the 19th century, the philosopher William James was severely depressed, suicidal, and felt completely helpless. So he decided to run an experiment on himself. For 1 entire year, he would assume 100% responsibility for absolutely everything that happened in his life, completely regardless of his grim circumstances. This radical mindset shift literally transformed him into one of the most influential psychologists in history. He realized that we are entirely responsible for our interpretations of life.
So, the crucial point is understanding the fundamental, absolute difference between fault and responsibility. Fault is past-oriented. It's about who caused the problem. Responsibility is present and future-oriented. It's about who chooses to respond. Think of it like this. If someone leaves a newborn baby on your doorstep, it is absolutely not your fault that the baby is there. No way. However, it is 100% your responsibility to decide what to do next. We stay stuck in victimhood when we confuse the two.
Life is exactly like a game of poker. Everyone is dealt a completely random hand of cards. Some people get excellent hands filled with wealth and perfect health, while others are dealt terrible hands involving trauma, illness, or poverty. But in poker, the person with the best hand doesn't always win. The game is won by the player who makes the best decisions with the cards they currently hold. Dwelling on the unfairness of your hand is a guaranteed losing strategy. True growth only comes from playing the cards you have as effectively as possible. Now, to actually make those good decisions, we have to cultivate a really healthy skepticism about our own beliefs, because certainty is the enemy of growth. When you are absolutely certain you're right, you close yourself off to any new information. So you have to force yourself to ask this vital, highly uncomfortable question, what if I'm wrong? Asking this forces you to look at whether you're holding on to a belief because it's objectively true or simply because it's comfortably protecting your ego. And let's be honest, our egos are incredibly fragile. This leads to what is called Manson's law of avoidance. The more something threatens your identity, the more you will actively avoid doing it. This is wild because it even applies to positive things. For example, if you secretly view yourself as a misunderstood genius artist, you might actually avoid showing your art to a gallery. Why? Because if they reject it, your identity is crushed. And if they accept it, well, you're no longer misunderstood. You end up avoiding the opportunity altogether just to keep your cozy little identity completely intact. Let's move to and see how this builds. To overcome that kind of paralysis, we have to totally rethink motivation. We usually think of motivation as a straight line, but it's not.
It's a continuous loop. Action leads to inspiration, which leads to motivation, which leads to more action. This is called the do something principle. If you are stuck, just do one tiny thing. Write one terrible sentence. Do one single push-up. That single tiny action breaks the paralysis and jumpstarts the entire motivation loop.
Now, taking action in our personal lives often means setting really firm boundaries. In a codependent dynamic, we see these blurry boundaries, where partners try to constantly fix each other or take responsibility for the other person's emotions. It's incredibly toxic. A healthy relationship, however, features crystal clear boundaries, where both people support each other, but they take absolute ownership of their own emotions. To really stand for something, you have to be willing to reject options and uphold these boundaries.
And upholding boundaries means saying no, which honestly flies in the face of our modern culture. We suffer from the paradox of choice. We are constantly told to keep our options open, don't settle down, swipe to the next thing. But endless options just lead to shallow lives. You end up constantly plagued by FOMO, the fear of missing out. True depth in a career, a hobby, or a relationship only comes from commitment. Committing to one path literally eliminates the heavy mental drag of endless choices.
To understand why we struggle so much with letting go and committing, we actually have to look at the work of anthropologist Ernest Becker. This is getting deep, but he argued that humans are terrified by the existential dread of our inevitable death. To cope with that, we build what he called immortality projects. These are our attempts to create something that outlasts our physical bodies, like building a massive business, creating art, or leaving a sprawling legacy. The problem is, when our egos tie our entire worth to these projects, we become incredibly defensive and anxious anytime they are threatened.
We are constantly weighing these two realities against each other, our temporary biological bodies and our desperate desire for a lasting legacy. When the author of this philosophy was a teenager, a friend of his tragically drowned. That sudden, visceral encounter with death completely shattered his illusions of invincibility. It forced him to realize that death is the ultimate reality check. It instantly strips away all of our superficial anxieties about what people think of us or how we look in photos.
So putting all of these concepts together gives us a highly practical framework for a deeply meaningful life. We can call it the 5 shifts. First, accept that pain is just part of life. Second, actively choose the struggles that you actually find meaningful. Third, take 100% responsibility for how you respond to your circumstances. Fourth, embrace your averageness to relieve all that unnecessary pressure. And fifth, constantly refine your values, ensuring they are internal and entirely within your control.
Which leaves us with one final ultimate metric to guide those values. On your deathbed, what will you actually care about? You won't care about your bank account, your job title, or how many followers you banked online. You are going to care about the depth of your relationships, how you treated others, and whether you lived true to your internal values. Let that be the standard that guides the struggles you choose today.
Please like and subscribe.